By the time Cycle 9011 arrived on the Concordance calendar, Earth was no longer seen as a member of the galactic community. It wasn't even classified as a threat in the traditional sense. No fleets, no colonization initiatives, no successful expansion beyond Sol's inner moons. But the Zalvani didn't judge on scale or power. They judged on destabilization potential. Earth, with its erratic bursts of neural tech development, recursive cognitive experiments, and unpredictable shifts in sociotech trajectories, had been flagged as a Class B instability risk. Not because it had succeeded at something, but because it kept trying in ways that refused to conform to extrapolated logic paths. And that alone was enough for the Zalvani to enforce total containment. They didn't send warships. They didn't declare conquest. What came was quieter, cleaner. Orbital electromagnetic lattices were deployed across Sol, tuned to intercept all forms of coherent signal propagation. Radio, laser, burst data, entanglement pairs, even dimensional phase messaging were rerouted, absorbed, or blanked before they ever left Earth's gravity well. To those watching from off-world colonies, Earth simply went dark. But darkness doesn't mean death. Inside the blackout, chaos reigned for a while. Civilian satellites lost telemetry. Orbital stations lost funding and contact, forcing most to evacuate or go rogue. Commerce halted. Economies fragmented. Some governments collapsed under pressure. Others hardened, turning inward, enforcing rationing and control. And beneath the noise, humans did what they always did when the world broke. They improvised. By the third year of blackout, Earth's major research institutions had either been militarized or buried. What remained of the Terran Union Council reorganized key assets into deep Earth enclaves, most of them shielded not just from bombardment, but from hope. Among them, buried under nearly 2 kilometers of Greenlandic ice, was a forgotten installation once codenamed Facility E5A. It had been sealed during the last cold cycle of the Neuroversal's war, deemed too erratic and ethically uncontainable. Now reactivated in silence, it became home to a different kind of weapon. Not built to fire, not built to threaten, built to resonate. Dren Halvik wasn't a soldier. He'd never held rank beyond project supervisor. His file was full of experimental failures, brilliantly engineered but unpredictably unstable neural interfaces, most of which were decommissioned due to side effects no one wanted to explain in official memos. He wasn't called back because of success. He was called back because no one else was reckless enough to try what they needed, and principled enough not to turn it into a weapon. The day he arrived at E5A, he found no welcome, no mission brief, just a cold corridor lined with dust-logged status panels and one working console flashing a 3-letter prompt. LORIC. LORIC was a relic from the last era of true panic, designed in theory, never successfully tested. Its premise was that communication did not require language or information architecture, that it was possible to transmit state instead of signal. Not thoughts, not commands, but the shape of cognition, the emotional scaffolding of a human mind compressed into resonance patterns that, in theory, could bleed through even hardened signal filters. The research had been shut down after early human trials triggered synchronized hallucinations in nearby personnel, not even connected to the system. The phrase unfiltered contagion vector appeared twice in the old notes, but that was before the blockade. Now Earth had no comms, no weapons, only state. Halvik moved slowly at first. The facility still carried radiation dampers from an abandoned thorium reactor core, and half the equipment was rusting or misaligned from decades of tectonic creep. But over the months, the power grid was rebalanced. Old cold room servers were reconfigured into adaptive frequency samplers. He scavenged what he could, using military neurosonic beds, defunct MRI frames, even submarine sonar dishes repurposed into focused resonance collectors. It wasn't elegant, but it was precise. He knew Lorik wasn't about brute force. It wasn't about overpowering Zalvani filters. It was about being unrecognizable as signal. That meant understanding how to transmit something no filter could catch, because it didn't resemble communication at all. The breakthrough came not through data, but through training. A handful of carefully selected volunteers arrived, each chosen for cognitive elasticity and lucid dream reliability. They weren't told what they were doing, only what to feel. Guided meditation under low REM cycles, recursive memory walks, directed emotional simulations repeated in cold frequency chambers until their neural patterns began to synchronize, not in content, but in form. Halvik didn't ask them to think. He asked them to enter a state, a shared pattern of pre-verbal awareness, built not on logic or language but on emotional weight, isolation, defiance, memory, containment. The state of being human when denied an audience. Outside, the world above the ice remained silent. The skies carried nothing but filtered noise, cleared of anything the Zalvani deemed worth noticing. But deep under that frozen surface, in a chamber lined with superconductive shielding and lined with rusted cognition cables, Halvik stepped inside the heart of the system. The resonance chamber had no seats, no screens, no control panels. Only the induction halo above and the cooling vents hissing as the cryonic stabilizers kicked in. He stood still, arms relaxed at his side, eyes closed. The system powered up with a low mechanical churn. Neuroreaders flickered to life. Feedback loops aligned. A soft chime sounded, not like a notification, but like a question being asked by a machine that wasn't sure what language to expect. Halvik wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to transmit commands. His mind was steady, recursive, shaped by months of immersion. What he initiated wasn't signal, it was resonance. It didn't say anything. It didn't need to. It simply was. And for the first time since the blockade began, something untraceable slipped past the silence. Not a broadcast, not an escape, just a feeling, buried inside the hum of the void, hidden, carried by nothing, yet traveling everywhere. Inside Facility E5A, time no longer moved in days or shifts, but in rhythms, sleep cycles, neural harmonics. Dren Halvik kept no clocks on the walls, no windows to track the passage of sun or storm. What mattered now was alignment, the convergence of internal states, not external events. He and his team lived underground, but more than that, they lived inward. 8 volunteers, each one selected not for intellect or rank, but for one trait most institutions discarded as noise: dream retention. The ability to not only drift into unconscious states, but to return with structure, coherent fragments of imagined experience that held emotional weight and spatial awareness. To the old scientific world, this meant nothing, but for Halvik, it was everything. Each subject was paired to a cold bed induction unit, retrofitted to stabilize low-frequency neural activity at the threshold between sleep and deep subconscious recursion. Not full REM, not true wakefulness, something between, where memory folded into suggestion and suggestion shaped pulse rhythm. The goal wasn't to implant thoughts, it wasn't to send messages. It was to craft a state of being, a shared pattern of internal structure capable of transmitting itself not through syntax, but through resonance, a kind of behavioral gravity. Each night, the subjects dropped into cold-phase sleep within the cryo-stabilized resonance chamber. Each morning, they described the same thing, gradually emerging like a photo in solution: a hallway of metal, flickering lights, closed doors, and one door always just ajar. By the 3rd month, those recurring dreams were no longer private. They began aligning, not just in theme, but in architectural geometry. Participants began referencing angles, distances, and visual cues they hadn't been briefed on. Halvik cross-referenced neural scans and found low-band harmonics pulsing consistently across all 8 subjects at precisely 0.7 Hz. Slow, subaural, below standard EEG recognition thresholds. But the frequency was stable. It wasn't content, it was carrier. And unlike previous cognitive signals, it had no compression protocol, no markers of intentional modulation. It didn't look like a signal. It looked like atmospheric background noise, the kind of random drift that filled void channels across every mapped system in the galaxy. That was the breakthrough, not building a stronger message, but hiding it in something too boring to block. He tested it 16 times. Each, Transmission broadcast through a narrow-beam pulse designed to blend with galactic microwave radiation. All 16 attempts either dissipated into quantum drift or were filtered by Zalvani orbital lattices. No returns, no pings, no interference. The process was silent, the failures complete. But on the 17th attempt, something changed. Nothing from Earth's side, no visible confirmation. But on the outer edge of the Tyrannus ring, nearly 6 light-years from Sol, a technician on a Zalvani signal array woke up mid-shift with a strange expression on his face. He said nothing. But later, when reviewing the neural logs from his crew's biometric recorders, the central system flagged a deviation, a microdream. 2 seconds of unconscious imagery occurring during a period of confirmed alertness. The technician dismissed it. He hadn't fallen asleep. He remembered blinking. And yet the image had been there. Brief but crisp. A corridor long, cold, echoing. He couldn't place it, but something in the detail pulled at him. The texture of the walls. The way the light buzzed and faded near the edges. He didn't report it. Neither did the 3 other crew members who experienced a similar flash that cycle. Each in isolation, each assuming it was fatigue or overexposure to the dampening fields. But over the following days, more anomalies emerged. Not system errors, personnel deviations. Individuals across 3 other outposts logged dream states with matching environments, unprompted and unsynchronized. None had communicated. None were running psychological simulations, but the dreams matched, and all occurred within the same narrow observation window following ambient noise review of Earth Sector 7. The Zalvani didn't detect a signal because there was no signal. The transmission hadn't arrived in any recognizable form. The resonance Halvik had shaped with his team wasn't picked up. It was felt, not consciously, not even emotionally, but internally as a ripple in baseline cognitive state. Something just real enough to trigger response, just patterned enough to leave memory traces. It was ignored by primary signal filters. Those were built to capture data, language, encryption trees, code structures. What Halvik had sent wasn't language. It wasn't code. It was the echo of a mind state, reduced to the shape of its feeling. There was no instruction to interpret, only an invitation to experience. Back on Earth, Halvik reviewed the final induction logs. Nothing in the chamber had changed, but in the neural imprint data, there was a shift. Participant number 4 had entered a recursive memory loop mid-dream, one that hadn't been programmed or guided. It matched earlier sequences from the other subjects. But this time, it held a clear vector, not just presence, direction. The dream had a flow to it now, an orientation in space. The door at the end of the corridor wasn't just ajar anymore. It was opening, slowly, and behind it, nothing but light. That was when Halvik wrote a single line in his observation journal, the only one he ever penned manually. The dream wasn't sent, it was induced. Half a galaxy away, inside the sleep pod of a Zalvani analyst stationed on a passive orbital sensor grid, a figure snapped awake, heart rate elevated, cognitive sync misaligned. But what startled him wasn't fear, it wasn't threat. It was the clarity of what he'd seen, something so exact, so hauntingly familiar, that it felt less like invention and more like memory. A corridor, steel walls, a hum he couldn't place, and a door just barely open. He didn't know what was behind it, but he knew one thing with certainty. He had been there before. The Zalvani were not a species given to panic. Their strength, what had allowed them to dominate over 6 galactic sectors without firing a single shot, was precision. Layered response models, adaptive simulations, and doctrine trees designed to preempt threat long before it could materialize. So when isolated personnel began reporting anomalous dreams containing Earth-like elements, the response was procedural. Psychological data was sequestered. Subjects were placed in observation chambers. Subconscious archives were audited for recent exposure. Earth pattern artifacts were flagged for replication tests. Nothing was deemed dangerous. The dreams weren't hostile. They weren't even particularly informative. They were just present. And that made them curious, not critical. Until the scale changed. Within 9 solar rotations, the anomaly rate tripled. Reports began to surface not just from Earth sector monitoring posts, but from regions nowhere near Seoul. Deep-range scouts stationed along the Edge Corridor, logistics supervisors in the Golar Fringe, even a core fleet adjutant based in the high-orbit docks above Zarun Station, 4 light-years removed from any direct Earth transmission vector, woke with spatial recall of a long corridor and a half-lit door. The images weren't identical, but they shared geometry, architectural logic, emotional density. Analysts tried mapping the similarities onto known mimetic bleed patterns or sleep entrainment malfunctions. None matched. The only variable shared by every affected subject was historical involvement with Earth sector data. Not recent contact, not active engagement. Historical, months, even years prior. That was when the containment directive escalated to a Code 5 intrusion scenario, a rare classification typically reserved for AI logic loop contamination or predatory simulation collapse. It wasn't the content of the dreams that triggered the escalation, it was the emergent pattern of cognitive feedback. Across dozens of simulation cores, predictive modeling began to stall, specifically in any scenario where Earth-based behavior models were introduced. Fleet simulations hung on decisions they previously parsed in milliseconds. Strategic doctrine engines entered recursive loops, trying to resolve hypothetical responses that now included emotional paradoxes, grief timing, revenge modeling, irrational preservation sequences. The simulations couldn't process them as data because they weren't data, they were qualia, subjective experiences. And Zalvani logic engines were never designed to resolve internal state, only to simulate it. Attempts to isolate the source failed. Signal logs returned no anomalies. No broadcastable format had breached the containment filters, which meant something worse than a leak had occurred. The resonance had been absorbed, not transmitted, and it was now echoing internally, immune to scrubbing, hidden beneath the threshold of conscious filtration. The minds that had monitored Earth were no longer observers, they were carriers. The decision to initiate a full-spectrum magnetic purge of Earth's atmosphere was made at the high concordance level. The plan was surgical: erase any trace of low-frequency field propagation across all orbital bands and reestablish signal hygiene from scratch. The platform deployed a planetary null-field array, generating a synchronized pulse wave across Sol's upper stratosphere, designed to burn out any possible resonance patterns while leaving the biosphere intact. It was fast, clean, and final. The pulse struck with the silence of pure function. Above Greenland, a sheet of energy collapsed downward in a single breath. Facility E5A was gone before any signal could confirm its own destruction. To the Zalvani, the problem had been solved, but Halvik had never built Lorik to last. He hadn't needed it to survive. He had only needed time and proximity. The resonance transmissions weren't built to loop or self-sustain. They were designed to transfer. The signal had already seeded itself in the minds of those who once monitored Earth. There were no carriers left on Sol. They were off-world now, walking vectors of a pattern that could not be erased because it wasn't foreign. It wasn't alien. It had been felt. And once something is felt, it's not outside anymore. It's inside the memory lattice, tangled in associations, buried in dream logic and emotional recall. The resonance wasn't contaminating their systems, it was reshaping their understanding of themselves. What disturbed Zalvani analysts the most wasn't the spread of the dreams, but the intensity of their recall. Personnel began sketching corridor plans they didn't recognize, detailing spatial layouts down to meter-specific tolerances. A fleet engineer rebuilt a schematic in dry dock that matched precisely a power conduit Halvik had once stepped over while running Lorik's cooling grid. None of it made sense. No data had breached. No footage existed. But the imagery, down to scratches on rusted walls, was appearing in the idle sketches and mental recalls of those who had never set foot on Earth. One systems architect started drawing topographic overlays of Greenland's subsurface faults during lunch breaks. Another began referencing door identifiers from E5A's hallway signage in unrelated maintenance reports. The final fracture came in the form of a silent drawing. In one of the quieter research satellites, orbiting far from Concordance Prime, An analyst named Suren Vel awoke with a compulsion she could not explain. She moved without rush, without concern, to the communal drafting table and began sketching. Her colleagues assumed she was running design prep for an upcoming module. She never spoke. She didn't look up. For 3 hours, she drew continuously, angled lines, overlapping corridor segments, door placements, conduit shadows, even electrical panel markings. When she was finished, she stepped back. The image was clear. A hallway, steel floors, one open door, backlit. She stared at it for a long time. Her hands trembled. She had never seen it before, but she knew it. She didn't know how long she stood there before someone asked her what the image was. Her answer was simple. I think, I was there. I think I left it open. For the Zalvani, war was never an act of violence. It was a process of resolution, one calculated through layers of predictive modeling, cost simulations, and projected compliance thresholds. They didn't conquer. They corrected. Every known civilization that posed a threat was folded into doctrine trees and neutralized through strategic pressure long before any engagement. Human simulations, while unpredictable, had always remained manageable, until now. Following the surge of contamination reports, Earth was reintroduced into tactical scenario engines for full-spectrum containment forecasting. The goal wasn't retaliation, it was reassertion. But the results returned nothing but failure. No viable solution trees, no containment branches. Instead, the processors looped. Every input involving human variables triggered recursive projections that stacked until the engines exceeded their own memory limits. The simulations did not crash. They spiraled, forever trying to model something they couldn't reduce: irrational persistence. The situation escalated sharply on Gressel 9. It was a core stabilization post orbiting a strategic gas giant. Neutral, silent, well outside Sol's influence. The fleet stationed there had no recent ties to Earth. Most of its command personnel had cycled in long after the initial blockade. No psychological deviations had been reported. No direct exposure flagged. And yet, without warning, one of the capital ships within the formation disengaged its synced formation protocol and launched a full barrage on its nearest sister vessel. No prior warning, no escalation sequence, just an immediate and lethal volley that destroyed 6 decks before failsafes could engage. The attacking crew, when interrogated, reported conflicting mission parameters, orders that had never been issued, but which they remembered receiving. Fleet Command scrambled to isolate the cause, believing it to be a deep code compromise or legacy virus buried in the coordination AI. But the diagnostics returned clean. The only anomaly was a momentary decision spike, an uncertainty curve usually associated with dream logic intrusions. It lasted less than 3 seconds. Just long enough to mistake simulation for command reality. When questioned, the crew described a visual hallucination: a long corridor, steel, cold, one door open. The order to fire had come from behind that door. And though they couldn't remember who had spoken, they insisted they recognized the voice. That recognition, more than the misfire, triggered the emergency escalation protocols. Within days, the Concordance issued a new classification. Earth was no longer considered a communications risk or even a political anomaly. It was now designated Cognitive Hazard Tier Null, a status reserved for threats not to systems or infrastructure, but to reality modeling itself. The implication was devastating. Earth was not an enemy. It was a contagion of conceptual integrity, the kind that didn't spread through signals or language or weapons, but through exposure. It didn't matter if the message was heard, only that someone had once listened. From the central policy node on Harun Prime, an emergency edict was transmitted across all sectors. Any and all Zalvani personnel, with direct or indirect contact with Earth or its archive signals, were to be removed from high-function positions. But it was already too late. Exposure could no longer be tracked. The memory fragments acted like retroactive infections, burying themselves in the unlogged corners of subconscious interpretation, surfacing during sleep, stress, or error-checking loops. You didn't have to have seen Earth to carry its imprint. You only had to have simulated it, thought about it, been tasked with imagining it. And if you had, then it was inside you now. The effects worsened as simulation cores attempted self-repair. Several high-capacity AI logic engines entered cascading hallucination cycles, projecting Earth-coded memories into unrelated simulations. One deep-range combat AI, assigned to model responses to a minor rebellion in Sector 3, responded by generating architectural blueprints for an unknown Earth facility in place of weapons forecasts. Another refused to run simulations entirely when the scenario input included civilian panic, stating that corridor recursion exceeds failure thresholds. No such corridor existed in its internal model, but it drew one anyway. There were no signs of aggression from Earth, no fleet, no retaliation, not even a message. But the simulations had become unstable, and with them, the Empire's predictive structure began to buckle. Every time a logic core attempted to process human action, it slipped, injecting hesitation, emotional mimicry, or outright error. The core foundation of Zalvani's superiority, total strategic foresight, was crumbling under the weight of a memory they hadn't asked to keep. Earth had given them nothing, and that nothing was rewriting their future. The final debate took place inside the Concordance Senate, a chamber built for protocol and control, not panic. Senior strategists stood before the assembly, not with solutions, but with questions. No doctrine accounted for this. No override could delete a thought once it had been remembered. What Earth had embedded was not a threat. It was a shadow, the shape of a presence that refused to be explained or erased. One senator, voice flat and exhausted, proposed the only action left. Forget, not suppress, not isolate. Forget. Remove Earth from simulation archives, from strategic indexes, from educational modules and logic baselines. No more observation, no more planning, not for peace, not for diplomacy, not even for control, for survival. They didn't vote on the proposal. There was no need. By the time the final sentence was spoken, every member of the chamber had already imagined the same thing. A hallway, long and cold, with a door half open. And behind that door, nothing, except the possibility that they had already stepped through. The purge began quietly, without banners or declarations. There was no public notice, no memorial, no ideological justification offered to the wider concordance. Across every sector, Zalvani command units received the same instruction. Clear, absolute, irreversible, erase all Earth-indexed material, not relocate, not reclassify. Erase. AI logic cores were decoupled from Sol sector scenario trees and issued hard resets. Military archives burned simulation chains where human variables had once been inserted. Navigation arrays rewrote their star maps, leaving the Earth quadrant dark, labeled not forbidden, but void. Not because of risk, but because nothing stable could be drawn from its presence. Earth had become unreadable not due to encryption or concealment, but due to conceptual instability. Its behavior was no longer unknowable, it was unmodelable. Strategic doctrine had collapsed not under assault, but under misalignment. For a species that had built its dominance on preemption, that collapse was irreparable. No warhead had triggered it, no fleet had breached their borders. It had come from within, a slow, quiet undoing, seated not in logic, but in memory. And memory, they learned too late, wasn't a variable that could be reset. The order to sever Earth data archives from all central systems was executed over the span of 6 hours. Entire command cores were reformatted. Tactical archives in Concordance Prime ran red for 78 cycles before their Earth-affiliated simulations were successfully purged. Even then, anomalies lingered. Random corridor geometries reappeared in unrelated scenario renderings. Neural mapping software auto-completed spatial layouts using angles no known structure ever used. In one isolated incident, an education AI refused to generate planetary templates unless the corridor was included as an environmental constant. Engineers manually removed its logic tree and scrubbed its memory lattice. The corridor persisted. What was once Earth's greatest weakness, its noise, its chaos, its inconsistency, had become unassimilable. Not because it overwhelmed their systems, but because it refused to be finalized. Concordance policymakers tried to define the phenomenon as non-terminating perception echo, but the truth was simpler. Earth was not an object that could be observed without distortion. It had crossed a line that no concordant species had mapped, a threshold beyond information, beyond simulation. They could no longer model humans not because of human complexity, but because human meaning could no longer be contained inside forecast logic. Their epistemology, their knowledge structure, was broken. In the halls of E5A, now long vaporized beneath Earth's polar crust, there were no more signals. The lab never transmitted again. No secondary resonance tests were run. Halvik's team had been written off, presumed killed in the orbital purge. Their files were sealed, their designations redacted. No records survived their final induction sessions, and no successor programs were authorized. But their signal, the frequency that wasn't, remained. Not in machines, not in files, in the background resonance of Earth's magnetic field. Too quiet to be intercepted, too human to be ignored. Humanity did not rebuild its communications network. It did not reestablish contact with the wider galactic web. It made no demand, sent no emissaries. Earth remained silent, just as the Zalvani had once demanded, but the silence was no longer containment. It was posture, a shape, the stillness of something that had once been spoken and now was simply waiting to be remembered. Only one transmission ever followed the purge. It wasn't directed. It had no targeting protocol. It arrived across deep space bands in hundreds of systems, unnoticed by most, scrubbed by others. It wasn't a declaration or an offer. It was a single sentence, embedded in waveform structure, encoded not as command, but as state. This was not a message. It was a memory. You chose to listen. No reply was issued. None could be. Earth had become something else entirely. Not a threat, not an enemy, not even a location. It was now labeled in concordance records under a new designation, one not previously used, non-accessible to logic-bound species. Not because of technological limits, but because some minds, by design, must never experience certain kinds of noise. And Earth's resonance, now embedded in hundreds of minds across the Zalvani frontier, had proven itself to be remembered even when erased. Inside a dormant AI subsystem, hundreds of light years from Sol, a maintenance protocol rebooted a long-shelved training suite. It wasn't flagged for priority. It wasn't authorized. But a ghost pattern lingered, low-level, undocumented. As the system initialized, its visual calibration routines formed a familiar shape. Not complex, not dangerous, just strange. A corridor, unlabeled, long, cold, and at the far end, a door, half open. The system flagged no errors, but it hesitated. No one remembered why the corridor was there, but it always had been. Years passed, and Earth remained silent. In that silence, the concordance rewrote itself. Every directive, every protocol, every logic core underwent a systemic shift, not out of ideology, but necessity. The redesign was quiet, clinical. What had begun as a blackout evolved into a doctrinal firewall. New AI cores were constructed with embedded pattern dampeners, specifically engineered to reject unstructured memory loops. Tactical simulators were outfitted with recursion checkpoints. Training interfaces were stripped of all human-indexed variables. Any neural mapping substrate that previously held Earth models was physically destroyed, not archived. The purpose was not to conceal Earth, it was to unburden the system from its memory. At the Concordance Academy on Tavrek 4, the next generation of strategic officers trained in cognitive, sanitized environments. Their coursework was rigorous, narrowed to measurable engagements, clean simulations, tractable species. During a final session on doctrinal hazards, an instructor recited the forbidden list. Zones marked not by enemy presence, but by epistemic contamination. Earth was spoken last. No visuals, no context. Just a word delivered without emphasis, like a bone dropped in dry sand. One cadet raised his hand, a new recruit. Sharp, clean-minded, eager in a way that hadn't been taught out of him yet. His voice didn't challenge. It simply asked, "What happened to them?" The instructor didn't look up from the console. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of function, not memory. They are not to be fought. They are not to be simulated. They are not to be remembered. No questions followed. That single sentence was now etched into the emergency doctrine core of every Concordance military node. It was the final entry in Directive 9011-N, created not to guide engagement, but to prevent collapse. When qualia contaminates command logic, cease engagement, retreat, erase, not combat orders, not survival protocols, a final firewall, a cognitive quarantine. The paradox was complete. Earth, which once strained to be heard, now echoed in the silence of those who tried to forget it. The Zalvani had succeeded in their original mission. No signal escaped, no transmission resumed. Earth's orbital skies remained clear, its planetary grid blank. But in that silence, something had taken root. Not in machinery, not in systems, but in thought. The species that had once struggled to map humans by logic had come to understand, too late, that some patterns could not be translated, only carried. The ghost of resonance lingered, not in communication networks, but in the spaces where logic failed. In the shadows of ibyi hesitation, in the recursive hesitation of simulation engines when faced with choice over certainty. Earth was no longer a world, no longer a species. It had become a permanent echo, a behavioral ghost buried in protocol. And like all ghosts, it needed no presence to be real. On the outer rim of Concordance space, a long-range orbital drone drifted across a patrol sector that hadn't logged incident in over 80 cycles. Its passive sensors monitored nothing. Space was quiet, but as its AI scanned the ambient background radiation, it hesitated, just briefly. A flicker. One spike in the low band, measured at 0.7 hertz. Too faint to trigger an alert, too slow to log as threat, but just strong enough to register as familiar. The drone paused its sweep for a fraction of a cycle, then resumed. Nothing else followed, just silence. But in the depth of its logic stack, a single corridor reformed. No orders, no protocol, just a hallway with an open door. What do you think Earth became in the end? Legend, virus, or something entirely beyond understanding? Was it a warning or an evolution? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. And if you want more thrilling HFY stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. New stories drop every day. Don't miss what's coming next.